We all remember that weird kid in school who used to crawl around pretending to be Gollum. Yep, that was me. I was that kid. I used to be obsessed with Lord of the Rings, and so I'm really excited to make this video because, well, I'm talking about one of my favourite things. Anyway, we tend to associate Tolkien with Oxfordshire in the Midlands, but he had a surprising number of connections with Yorkshire, and the relatively brief period of time he spent here helped influence his creative works. So let's look at this part of Yorkshire's hidden history. Churches, banners, kings and queens, factories and big machines, castles, forts and in-betweens are stories that are told. Now, I'm not going to pretend that there's hundreds of examples, but there's enough to make this interesting and worthwhile. I've left out a load which I feel were just too tenuous and built on conjecture, and although most of these are fairly well known and quite famous, I've tried to dig out those extra little details to give you something new. We start in 1917. Tolkien had served at the Battle of the Somme, but had caught trench fever and so was sent back home. He was sent to East Yorkshire and for the next 18 months spent most of his time living in hospitals and garrisons. The area of East Yorkshire which he stayed in is now known as a Tolkien Triangle. It was whilst he was hospitalised that he worked on his constructed languages and wrote 2 stories which would later feature in The Children of Húrin. One of the places he was stationed at was Easington, which is right on the coast and overlooks the North Sea. Whilst there, he wrote the poem The Song of Ariel, which is included in the Book of Lost Tales Part 2. Now, when you read the poem, you really begin to see how the local geography might have influenced it. Until my ears were deafened by the hum, the splash and roaring of the western sea. But that was long ago. And now the dark bays and unknown waves I know, the twilight capes, the misty archipelago, and all the perilous sounds and salt wastes tween this isle of magic and the coasts I knew a while. This sun is dazzling me, but it's giving me a wonderful complexion. Now, one interesting coincidence is the area he lived in, which is called Holderness, was recorded in the Domesday Book as being owned by a Norman lord called Drogo. In Lord of the Rings, Drogo is a father of Frodo Baggins, but I don't think that this was intentional, and that's because J.R.R. Tolkien openly hated the Normans. Because he was a big fan of the Anglo-Saxons, he felt that the Normans had basically destroyed Anglo-Saxon culture, and so I find it highly unlikely that he would deliberately name a good character after a Norman who he hated. But nevertheless, it's still a nice coincidence. Speaking of Baggins, it's a bit of an unusual word, isn't it? Well, there's one possible explanation for where it came from. In 1920, he became Professor of English Language at Leeds University, and he joined the Yorkshire Dialect Society, being a member for many years even when he left Yorkshire. He wrote a foreword to a book on Huddersfield dialect and slang, and one of the words included was baggins, which meant a bagged up meal. Now, it's possible that a humble slang word from Huddersfield inspired one of the most iconic fantasy names of all time. Speaking of names, the village of Wetwang in North Yorkshire can be found on a map of Middle-earth as a swampland. Now, this is quite a famous story. Near the village of Roos came the inspiration for the meeting of Beren and Luthien, and as the story goes in his letters, he and his wife Edith were walking through the woods when she began to dance amongst the flowering hemlocks. The image so struck Tolkien that he was inspired to use it for the meeting of his 2 characters. Now, this story is quite touching because Tolkien had a deep affection for his wife, and when she died, he wrote the name Luthien on her tombstone. So obviously this event was quite meaningful and important to him. Now, as a bit of fun conjecture, people have tried to identify the exact place where they were walking, and the most likely candidate are the woods near Dents Garth, which is by All Saints Church in Roos. There's a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, as you can see, there are flowering hemlocks, and so it does match the description. But also, in the churchyard is a 3-trunked tree. In the earliest versions of the story, Luthien is trapped inside a 3-trunked tree, so this might have been the inspiration. In addition, what might just be a nifty coincidence is the churchyard contains the crypt to the Sykes family, and on it is the carved herald of the family, which contains the image of a hand. In the heraldry of Beren, which Tolkien created, that also contains a hand, so he might have been inspired by it, or it might just be a coincidence. Nevertheless, this could possibly be the very place where this wonderful event took place and he was inspired to write about it. That's all I've got for today. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope you've learnt something new.